Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first of two boot camps for the week on utilizing New Era funding. My name is Allie. I'm a manager at RMI and will be your MC for today and tomorrow. For those new to RMI, next slide, please. We are an independent, nonpartisan, global nonprofit organization of over 600 experts across disciplines working to accelerate the clean energy transition and improve lives. Today, we'll be focusing on maximizing the financial opportunity of the New Era program, and tomorrow we will turn to the specifics of defining an ambitious New Era plan. Next slide, please. You can go for it one more time. Okay, great. To put this a little more plainly, we could think about New Era like playing a board game. Today we are going to walk you through the rules of the game and the different kind of pieces you have at your disposal and how you can use them. Tomorrow, we will dive into some of the moves you can make and how those moves will play out over time. You can move forward. A few logistics. Given the sensitivity around these applications, we're running this through a Zoom webinar, so participation and Q&A will remain confidential. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, which will send your questions to our panelists directly, and we can answer you directly, privately, or out loud during a Q&A session, but nothing you will send to us is broadcast to the group out loud. With that, I want to introduce our team for today. Your presenters today are Sam Mardell and Uday Varadarajan. Your panelist interviewer is Christian Fung. All three of them are members of RMI's electricity team who focus on financial topics related to federal policy. And now I'm going to pass it off to Uday to say a few framing words about why we are so excited about New Era and what RMI views as our biggest value add to support co-ops in this space. Uday.
Thank you so much, Allie, and welcome to all of you and appreciate you very much taking a little time to speak with us and work with us as we try to identify ways that we believe cooperatives can take advantage of these historic programs in ways that create value for all of the different mission goals that you have as a cooperative serving your members. RMI is very excited, of course, as a not-for-profit entity focusing on clean energy, on the role that this program and others like it can play in the clean energy space. But we are particularly excited about the role that New Era and related programs can also play in making clean energy truly work financially, as well as from a clean energy perspective for your customers and members in ways that increase resilience, both from a grid perspective as well as a financial perspective. And we're excited to start working with cooperatives in whatever way that we can be helpful in helping you take advantage of these programs to achieve their maximum potential. With that, if we can move to the next slide, I just wanted to flag that while RMI has studied some of these programs and has indeed compiled materials that should help provide clarity on different aspects of the use of New Era, I wanted to flag, first of all, that the federal government is the ultimate final source of information on the use of these programs. And RUS has committed to continue posting clarifications and guidance and Q&A on its website, and those should be considered the final authorities on any issues that we might discuss here. Similarly, we will discuss some of the issues surrounding tax credits, and we expect that Treasury will be posting guidance soon, particularly on aspects of these tax credits that are relevant to the conversation that we're having today, and those should be, again, considered final. We look forward to having the opportunity to engage with you all, both during the session today and tomorrow, and would encourage you to reach out to us for clarifications, questions, and for deeper engagement if you believe it would be helpful. As I mentioned, we believe that the information that we're providing you is current as of today, but we do expect that as guidance will evolve and is posted, there may be changes that are made to some of the issues that we've covered here, and we look forward to engaging with you further on the topic. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Sam Mardell, who will begin our training session.
Thank you, Dan. We can move to the next slide. I want to echo Uday's words. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today and spending some time with us. We know this is a busy time, in particular for cooperatives that are starting to form or think about their new era applications. And we hope that this webinar can provide some value and help for folks as they start structuring their requests for the new era program. So this is our agenda for today. We'll start with some basic framing about how we're seeing what we're calling maybe the rules of the game, how we understand the program and the way that it can provide financing support for cooperative plans. And then getting into a little bit more detail about some of the logic and how we're thinking about ways to kind of structure funding requests from New Era that are well suited to delivering both the physical resource portfolio that the applicant is interested in delivering, as well as maximizing sort of benefits for members. So next slide, please. So really, we're focused on the New Era program from the USDA, and in particular to provide information that we think can be really supportive for cooperatives that are developing applications. We hope this information can help while you're thinking about your funding requests. And New Era is really important to consider alongside some of the modifications to the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for clean energy. So these are kind of the two pieces, two policy pieces that we'll be focusing on most today. Move forward. Two more times. So there are kind of three themes that we'll touch on repeatedly throughout the day. And the first one, the top one here, is that cooperatives can use New Era to chart a financially sound and clean future. And this is an important point. We think that New Era, in addition to helping cooperatives define and fund a resource plan that brings in clean technologies and can really provide really important and meaningful benefits to members, it can also be used to strengthen the financial position of cooperatives for both planned and unknown investments in the future. And so for that reason, we think it's a well-designed program to help with defining and realizing resource plans in the near future, but also allow cooperatives to kind of strengthen their financial position. Second, we acknowledge that cooperatives must make a number of complex decisions with near-term deadlines. So the letters of intent, the competitive portion of the New Era program, are due at the end of August. And while the written portion of the letter of intent is quite short, only about 3 pages, there are many decisions that need to happen in order to define both a resource plan, the types of investments that a cooperative will want to make using the financing, as well as chart out an associated funding request that will allow cooperatives to realize that resource plan, which is the focus of our session today. And finally, we want to focus on how cooperatives can maximize the opportunity with an effective funding request. And so thinking about how to use the flexibility of the New Era program, which can provide both grants as well as loans at different levels, and how to think through how to balance a portfolio of grants and loans within a funding package, and how that attaches to the ability to take in direct pay tax credits, for example, to define a funding plan that can really realize the maximum physical resource portfolio that is competitive for the program while creating a lot of value for members. Next slide, please. We can move forward as well. And so one of the reasons why RMI is so excited and interested in the New Era program is because we think it's really well designed to help resolve some pretty important financing challenges that cooperatives faced before the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last summer. And so we've bucketed these financing challenges into 3 categories. The first is an equity challenge. So cooperatives, when looking especially at generation and transmission organizations across the country, we see a lot of G&Ts as fairly highly leveraged. And cooperatives, unlike investor-owned utilities, are unable or were unable to raise equity quickly, except through member rates. And therefore, we're somewhat constrained in their ability to make large investments in things like pretty capital-intensive clean energy resources quickly. And so the combination of direct pay as well as grants through New Era are really helpful for allowing cooperatives to take in equity much more quickly and enable some of the big investments that we see as important. Second, an ownership challenge. Co-ops really didn't have the ability to utilize the clean energy tax credits that were such an important incentive for many entities in building wind and solar, because many do not sort of owe a federal tax liability and were unable to therefore monetize the tax credits. And that's really changed with direct pay for the ITC and the PTC, which can allow co-ops to own assets and pass on the full benefits of wind and solar and storage to their members. And finally, a stranded asset challenge, which we know is really important to many G&Ts that they're thinking about the costs of stranded assets and how to ensure that members don't need to pay these full costs, because fossil capital costs don't necessarily go away with the deployment of new clean energy resources. And so New Era is really designed to help address this challenge and can offer low-cost debt to help either to refinance those costs, really. And so we'll talk more about how New Era can enable that goal as well. Next slide. And so this slide is really meant to demonstrate this point and sort of the issue that we're seeing around sort of the equity challenge for cooperatives. And so we can see sort of cooperative equity ratios. And so this is the ratio of equity to total capitalization, and a financial ratio that we're really paying attention to in our modeling and our thinking about New Era and tax credits and these programs' ability to help cooperatives realize resource plans and make new investments to benefit members. And so a threshold that we pay attention to a lot is sort of the 20% threshold for equity to total capitalization. And we see an incentive for cooperatives really to avoid becoming leveraged above that level because they can risk credit downgrades and having to take on more expensive debt. And so the ability of cooperatives to take on equity through grants or direct pay investment tax credits is really important. The middle chart is some preliminary analysis and basic analysis that we've done to sort of scope out from a technical perspective how possible it is for cooperatives to really deploy wind and solar and storage in their service territories without running into kind of firm technical constraints. And so we see a potential to do a fairly high level of decarbonization. But the challenge is, before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, the inability of cooperatives to really quickly raise equity without burdening their members was preventing the ability of co-ops to make those investments in new and often very less expensive generation resources like wind and solar. And so the chart on the right kind of shows in the red bars this is a rough estimate, but showing what we see in terms of the ability for cooperatives to kind of now make investments in the resources that they weren't able to before by taking in equity more quickly with grants from New Era. So this is, I guess, just a summary of one reason why we're so interested in looking hard at this program. Next slide, please. We can proceed. And then a final point for this introduction, we really see New Era as creating possibilities for coordination between generation and transmission organizations and distribution cooperatives. And I know there's a lot of coordination happening between G&Ts and their distribution cooperative owners already. But we see some possibilities for coordination in terms of looking at New Era requests. And we were glad to see sort of 3 application buckets put out by the Rural Utilities Service for how they're going to be administering the program and directing funds through New Era. And so the larger generation and transmission organizations won't be competing directly against smaller distribution cooperatives. And so we see that as pretty important for encouraging possibly a collaborative dynamic within the program. There's also a lot of flexibility in the program, both in the types of technologies that can be funded and activities that can be funded by the program, as well as the type of financing that entities can receive. And we see this flexibility as important for allowing different types of cooperatives to apply and make use of New Era, both larger organizations that own a lot of generation capacity, as well as some smaller distribution cooperatives. We're hoping that all can sort of make use of the program. And finally, RMI for a long time has done modeling to understand the benefits of demand side flexibility in resource planning. And so we see opportunities for coordination between entities that might be looking at large supply side investments from New Era, as well as entities that are more able to deploy investments in demand side flexibility, for example. And something that we're interested to track and support is how entities, mostly distribution cooperatives, can think about demand side flexibility as complements to some of the larger investments that if they're supplied by a generation and transmission organization, the GNT might be thinking about. So now we'll turn back to Uday to get into a little bit more detail about some of the rules of the program and how we're thinking about some of these financing issues.
Thank you so much, Sam. And if we move on to the next slide, what I'm going to try to do is to review a little bit of what you all might already know as the rules of the game when it comes to the nature of the financial support that New Era is able to provide and its relationship to other resources that you may have available to you through direct pay. And the piece I'm going to focus on, and I think one of the challenges, one of the more challenging issues in navigating the right type of financial package to ask for and how that package really interacts with other choices that you make, really has to do with focusing on the interplay that we see between issues tied to the structure of your request to New Era, so the specific mix of loans or grants under which conditions, with the characteristics of the resources and the incentives that they may provide, whether, as we'll discuss, whether it has to do with the investment tax credit, production tax credit, and then finally, related to the nature of the specific financing challenges that you face on your balance sheet, your equity ratio, limitations in the program. So the first thing we're going to really do is to do a quick overview of what are the key characteristics of the financing packages that are allowed through New Era that are relevant for kind of addressing and figuring out how to navigate this game. So on to the next slide, please. So first, let's talk a little bit about the award structure for New Era. Now, as we mentioned, the award can consist of some combination of grants and or loans up to, for any individual applicants, $970 million. As we mentioned, the New Era program has been bucketed depending on the size of your cooperative, with roughly 60% of the funds available to the largest cooperatives, and 20% buckets for medium and smaller size cooperatives. Now, each entity can receive up to 10% of the total New Era appropriation, hence the maximum of about $970 million. Now, the important point is that the amount of total volume of financing that this $970 million translates into depends on the type of support, whether you've chosen grants and loans, as well as the specific conditions or interest rates associated with the loans themselves. And related to that, the specific way in which that the terms and conditions of the loan translates into a portion of that $970 million is tied to the cost to government of those loans, which is known as the credit subsidy cost. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this credit subsidy cost shortly. Now, how do the grants work? One important point here is that grants can account for up to 25% of total project costs for whatever you might choose to finance for with the funding from New Era. Now, note that this is not just 25% of appropriated dollars. That is, if you choose to build, or if your total project that you'd like to finance using New Era funds is a $4 billion project, roughly, you can ask for the full $970 million in grants if you choose to, and get your loan financing for the rest somewhere else if you choose to. So in principle, all of the appropriation could be grants, but this may or may not be the best way to use those appropriations for your particular financial situation or for the particular resources that you may wish to deploy. So we'll talk more about that as the conversation continues today and tomorrow. So finally, I just, in terms of the New Era structure, how do the loan works and how are they set up? What we know is that the loans can be set to either be 0% interest loans, 2% interest loans, or based on the federal government's cost of borrowing, treasuries. And we should note that that's not the only way that loans can work or lending support can be provided. New Era can also be used to modify existing RUS debt, or can be used to address or refinance third-party debt that might be related to a stranded asset on your system at some point in the coming years. Now, note that there are two major categories of awards. If you choose to get an award for just a project, loans can only account for up to 75% of total project costs. However, this constraint disappears if you choose to receive an award for at the system level. And so this is a distinction that's important, and the system award is a bit more flexible from that point of view, as it isn't tied directly to a project and doesn't have this limitation on loan costs. Now, on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about this issue that I raised about the credit subsidy cost, because we believe that this issue is critical to understand the challenges that one faces in kind of trying to figure out what one can do with the amount of appropriated dollars that one might receive in principal in an award, and that one should assume in making an application. So, of course, indeed, that $970 million limit could be entirely taken up by grants. But if you choose not to do that, here is a rough rule of thumb for how to think about how far that money can go. If you choose to get a loan at 0% interest rate, then that $970 million can be levered to roughly around $2.3 billion in lending at 0% interest rate, given the credit subsidy cost that the USDA published in its in the president's budget this year for the program. Similarly, if you choose to do a 2% interest rate, that jumps to roughly double, about $4.8 billion in loans at 2% interest rate. Now, one other issue here is that at least currently, based on our reading and some preliminary conversations with USDA, we believe that right now, the credit subsidy cost as published in the president's budget recently would package in loans at Treasury's interest rate with that at 2% interest rate. And that might mean that the maximum leverage that you can get is actually the same with the credit subsidy cost associated with the 2% interest rate is the same as the Treasury, the credit subsidy cost of Treasury's interest rate, at least based on preliminary conversations. We believe that that view of the New Era program would be greatly limiting. We're currently speaking with the program about clarifying this issue. If the loan at Treasuries were calculated separately, we believe, for example, that the credit subsidy cost that was achievable with a loan at Treasuries could be quite a bit higher, so that the $970 million in credit in subsidies could lead to a much larger potential size of loan if so desired. And similarly, if a loan was available at slightly higher than rate. So again, this is one of those issues that we expect that USDA will clarify. But at the least, even at 2%, the point I want to really make sure that we leave you with is that that $970 million can leverage a much larger financing package than would initially seem possible. Can we go on to the next slide? So while we see that these options do leave you with different potential leverage points, there are a few other considerations that we think are really important here. First, we need to know, as you consider the different options that are available to you, one of the, if not the most important criterion for this particular program is ultimately it's going to be based and judged on greenhouse gas reductions, which is direct reductions in greenhouse gases associated with facilities that you as a cooperative would own, or avoided, as well as ultimately avoided future greenhouse gas reductions, and issues like the renewable percentage of their portfolio and decreases in carbon intensity. All of these metrics are greenhouse gas reduction metrics that you'll be judged by. Maximizing those greenhouse gas reductions needs to be balanced, of course, with the financial position of your utility and the choice of this particular lending portfolio that achieves that. Now, Of course, in order to do that, you have to maintain your equity to total capitalization ratios so that as a cooperative, you will have the flexibility to continue to have the access to capital to address what may be unknown unknowns on a forward-looking basis, and to be ready to address potential future investment needs if you choose to move down a path of deploying capital rapidly to transition your system. At some point, you will have additional capital needs that go beyond the time frame of this program that you'll need to meet. So using these financial programs available today to strengthen your balance sheet, to allow you the flexibility in your debt to equity ratios and in your broader cash flows to do what you need to do in future to meet all other needs, not just clean energy needs, is a critical criteria that we think you need to be. We know that co-ops are very interested in. And then the final issue I wanted to flag is the important potential role that some of the tax credits may play, because many of the tax credits that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly those that are available to utilities, are now available to you as direct pay tax credits. These tax credits can be directly monetized with some constraints that we'll discuss later to both provide some of the financing for the new investments in wind, solar, and storage, at least in the long term, with potentially a bridge issue that we'll also discuss. But in principle, these should provide another source of equity that can mitigate some of the balance sheet impacts of taking on significant debt on a forward-looking basis. In addition, it's important to note that those tax credits come with adders, particularly bonus adders, for siting assets in energy communities, as well as for the use of domestic content. And unfortunately, on a forward-looking basis, penalties for not using domestic content for direct pay eligible entities, unless those assets have started construction early enough. So these different considerations all need to play into the risks and rewards associated with using these incentives. And what we'll do for the rest of this conversation and into tomorrow is really start to look at each of these issues and start discussing and unpacking how they interplay with each other to hopefully provide some helpful guidance in thinking through questions of which of these specific options could be used in different ways to maximize the value that you bring to your customers while minimizing the risk that you take on as a utility and on behalf of your members. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Sam and Christian for a broader Q&A session.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you. So yeah, please feel free to send your questions in the Q&A section. We're just getting started here. Uday, stepping back for a second, what do you think is the most important thing to focus on for co-ops for their letters of intent?
So, the top line for this program at its heart is fundamentally reducing emissions. This program requires that carbon emissions are reduced as much as possible, and that's going to be critical for achieving for really sort of showing your application has value above others. And so I would flag that as still the most important question. But in order to do that, it is critical to optimize the utilization of the financing available to achieve maximal emissions. And because most of the approaches are capital intensive, this is really about playing that game around maximizing the use of both the New Era program and other incentives in achieving decarbonization by levering up those assets in a way that creates the opportunity to deploy capital.
And yeah, speaking of that levering up, can you elaborate a little bit more on the credit subsidies and how those are actually determined, and kind of stepping through in more detail why the lower interest rate loans are leading to more financing?
So the way that credit subsidy cost is calculated is determined in large part by a law called the Federal Credit Reform Act, which allows the government to provide loans without necessarily having money that is appropriated from Congress that covers the full volume of that loan. Instead, the cost of the loan is really calculated based on the expected cost to government over the life of the loan of providing that credit. And that allows the government to use limited appropriated dollars from the appropriations process and budget on an annual basis to provide more lending than would otherwise seem to be the case. Now, the implication of that, though, is that ultimately, if a loan is going to be more costly than it costs for the government to borrow, then that's going to cost the government more than it otherwise would. So that's why a 0% or 2% interest rate, which is below the government's cost of borrowing, has a significantly higher cost than a treasury rate loan.
Thanks, Uday. And then a question we had on the differences between what you just said, a 0% loan versus a grant. So why can't a 0% loan be kind of leveraged for a higher amount versus kind of just a straight up grant where that appropriation is going to the grant? Is it because they expect you to pay it back during the program period and then they can reinvest that? Or can you explain that a little bit?
So 0% loan still requires you to ultimately repay the principal, and that provides a stream of benefits that allows for greater leverage than a grant would apparently allow it. Again, though, however, a 0% loan still leaves a utility relative to a grant with the need to raise equity. And the difficulty is that that need to raise equity creates an additional financial burden if it isn't otherwise met, for example, through direct pay credits. So a 0% loan, while it might be quite attractive and seems to lever up the amount provided by the appropriation, still has a challenge in that there is a need to sort of match that with equity. And that equity isn't, if there isn't a grant component to the, or some other approach like a direct pay ITC coming in, there is still a need to sort of address that equity need.
Great. And then final question here, just clarifying, or one of the final questions here, clarifying on the 0% loan. There's a question on the 0% loan only being used for stranded asset refinancing. Can you kind of go through that and its uses?
So the 0% loan is available as one of the options for the program. And indeed, the challenge, I believe the restriction is that the grant portion alone cannot be used purely for paying off the cost of stranded assets, that the grant is restricted to some degree in that manner. But again, for system financing, there is quite a bit of flexibility in how that grant and loans can be used in combination to address the needs that any particular cooperative might have.
Great. And I got one more right here, Uday. So for the money available for like battery, solar, and wind, can that money actually be used with developers, independent power producers and developers to complete development and commercialize in collaboration with cooperatives as a key part of their business plan? So kind of that difference between ownership and third-party ownership.
So in principle, the funding that's available through New Era is quite flexible and can be used in different ways to facilitate the deployment of clean energy. In principle, it can be used to it can be used in ways that aren't necessarily directly tied to ownership of the of any underlying asset. The one push I will make is just that as a result of direct pay tax credits, ownership or some use of that direct pay authority can be a very attractive financial proposition for a cooperative, particularly when considering the full package of direct pay and equity options available. So again, while it certainly can be used in ways that can, for example, bring in third parties to mitigate the risk of ownership, we would argue that long-term ownership by a cooperative is far more attractive than it might have been in the past. But it provides options that can allow a third party to come in, bring its equity, bring its capabilities in to mitigate those challenges, or indeed allow for a cooperative to play a more differentiated or subtle role in the facilitation of development. And so there is quite a bit of flexibility.
Great. That's all the questions we have for now. And just as a reminder, we'll have one last Q&A session at the very end. So please keep putting in your questions and we'll have another Q&A session. I'll toss it back to Sam.
Thank you, Krishna. Did I get the slides back up? Great. So Zidai's spoken to, determining a funding request is a really important part of the letter of intent process in the entire New Era application. And so while the program is really going to be scored, and the most important piece are the sort of expressed greenhouse gas reductions from a plan that's submitted to the New Era application process, determining a funding request that can realize that plan while maximizing member benefits is a really important part of the planning and the work that needs to be done in order to secure and then use an award. And so in this next section, I'm going to lay out some of the more, I guess, qualitative logic for how our team is thinking about ways to structure a funding request for New Era. And then we'll turn back to Uday to talk in some more detail about the precise decisions that a cooperative can make and show some of the modeling that we've done, kind of lay out our view on different options for structuring an award request. Next slide, please. We can progress through. So as the basic strategy for how we're thinking about forming a funding request, at the outset, an applicant for the New Era program will be defining a plan, sort of the investments that are eligible for support from the New Era program that will require a certain amount, a certain dollar value in financing. And as I mentioned, that financing will be delivered through a combination of grants and loans, and those loans will be leveraged up. And so the applicant really needs to decide what is the correct combination of grants and loans that can meet that financing need for the project. The constraints that we're building in here in our thinking, one, we don't want to use member equity when possible. So member equity was the way that historically cooperatives were able to build equity to then realize new projects and investments. But there are now possibilities through receiving grants or receiving investment tax credits that allow cooperatives to raise equity much more quickly without having impacts on member rates. And so in our modeling, in our analysis, in this qualitative logic, we're thinking about maintaining an equity to capitalization ratio that is high enough to avoid any risk of credit downgrades, while also building sort of flexibility and long-term balance sheet flexibility to make investments in the future. And so again, the decisions are what loan and at what cost, or what combination of loans for the funding package, and then thinking about the tax credits, so decisions between taking the ITC or the PTC, and then really looking at different outcomes from a certain plan. So we're thinking about assessing a package in terms of the net present value savings for the utility. We ultimately get from each package a combination of loan, grant, and tax credits that speak to that total NPV savings. We can look at the incremental value of electing a production tax credit relative to an investment tax credit. We can talk through some of the slightly nuanced decision-making around why you might elect to take a PTC versus an ITC, given that there is more flexibility now from the Inflation Reduction Act about which resources those can apply to. And then how much additional equity does a plan build on the utility's balance sheet over time as a result of using the New Era program and direct pay tax credits? So these are kind of the basic logic for how we're thinking about structuring a funding request. Next slide, please. So breaking this down into parts. Again, before the Inflation Reduction Act, cooperatives were really constrained in their ability to raise equity quickly. We see from looking at financial statements that a lot of G&Ts in particular are fairly highly leveraged. And cooperatives could raise equity by retaining member rates. But the Inflation Reduction Act opens up new possibilities to raise equity quickly. So again, the New Era grants, direct pay investment tax credits, which can be taken in at the end of year one of a project's operating life. And then also ideas around, and I think this speaks to some of the questions that we've received so far, possibilities to include third-party equity to help capitalize projects is a model that we're looking at as well. Next slide. So an important piece is that grants can be structured in different ways. So when thinking about how an entity will receive a grant through a system award, the grant can be received either as a direct investment to a cooperative to make investments in sort of the assets that it's deploying and the investments it's making as part of a New Era package. A grant can also take the place of a cooperative's equity contribution to a specific project. Finally, we also see a possibility where RUS could distribute the grant to member distribution cooperatives as sort of a prepayment for future investments from the distribution cooperatives, the G&T over time. An important caveat here is that grants can fund up to 25% of the cost of a project, but as I explained, that is not restricted to the appropriated dollar amount. That's the entire cost of the project, which can be much higher than sort of the maximum appropriation. But it means that the grant must be paired with other financing, either through New Era or tax credits or from other sources. But really the important part here is that the grants can be used to build equity and enable investments. And we see as sort of an important part of the strategy of forming a funding package or a funding request for the program is thinking about the equity needs and using grants to fulfill those equity needs as much as possible. Next slide, please. Investment tax credits are another way that cooperatives can build equity. And with the new adders for domestic content and energy communities, we really see a possibility for up to 50% direct pay investment tax credits for cooperatives, which is a valuable incentive and one that can be used to really build a meaningful amount of equity quickly for a cooperative. I think importantly for the energy communities, we've seen some maps showing where energy communities are located around the country, and there's pretty good overlap, I think, with a lot of cooperative service territories. And so there really is a possibility for getting a pretty high investment tax credit for a lot of cooperatives looking at investments that would use the ITC. As a caveat, the ITCs are realized at the end of year one of the project's life. And so many cooperatives will need to seek bridge financing to kind of fill that gap. And later on in this conversation, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about possibilities we see for that financing. But it's something to note is that when thinking about using the ITC to build equity and enable sort of project investments, bridge financing can become important in those cases. In our modeling, we see the production tax credit often leading to higher net present value outcomes, and we'll show that modeling in more detail later on in the talk today. Sort of the solar PTC optionality can be really important, especially in places where there's a strong solar resource and the cooperative has the ability to take the highest net present value savings option in their New Era plan. But unlike the ITC, PTCs can't really be used to build the equity up front for the project. And so when a cooperative is thinking about using the PTC in forming a funding request, that's where the grants come in and are really important as the source of equity for the investments. Next slide, please. So here's a basic outline of some advantages of taking the ITC versus the PTC for cooperatives. It will be an important decision for many resource investments. The chart on the right, I believe, is taken from Konresnik and really just shows that where there are better solar or wind resources, it's often a better decision to elect to take the PTC, and that can lead to higher net present value savings outcomes in the long run for cooperatives. But as discussed, that means that cooperatives must raise the required equity for the project from other sources, and especially New Era grants. ITCs can be used as an immediate equity injection and an important source of equity, and can raise 40 or 50% of the equity for in a project, which is meaningful and can really help sort of strengthen the position of cooperatives. And so it will be an important decision for co-ops when looking at their particular circumstances to determine where to take the ITC versus the PTC on projects. Next slide, please. An important note is cooperatives are eligible to take direct pay tax credits, and this is really important. It will enable co-ops to really take advantage directly of these important clean energy incentives for the first time, and pass those benefits on directly to members, which is exciting. But there are rules around the direct pay tax credits that are important to consider, and especially the domestic content requirements, which are meaningful for direct pay, because if the cooperative if the projects fail to meet domestic content requirements, depending on the year in which the start of construction happens for a project, the value of the direct pay tax credit can diminish and then be reduced to zero for projects that start after 2025. So we have a timeline here that shows the amount of manufactured product and the domestic content requirement. Domestic content requirements are 100% for US content, steel and iron. And there's a manufactured product definition that ramps up over time. So in 2023 and 2024, to meet the domestic content requirement, it must be 40%. By 2027, 55%. And this separately creates a 10% bonus for the ITC. But for the purpose of direct pay, a tax credit, a direct pay tax credit for a project that starts construction in 2023 and meets that 40% threshold, it'll receive 100%. If it fails to meet that domestic content requirement, for projects that start construction in 2024, the tax credit is reduced by 10%. For projects that start in 2025, by 15%. And by 2026 and further out, for projects that fail to meet the domestic content requirement, they're no longer eligible for direct pay. And so here we see an incentive for cooperatives that are seeking to build projects that will take the direct pay tax credit to start construction as soon as possible and trigger the safe harbor rules, 4-year safe harbor that will protect and secure that tax credit before the operations begin. So we see it as really important to start early and kind of move quickly on these investments. I'll note that in the guidance, the phase out for direct pay can be waived if the administrator determines that the domestic content is unavailable or raises costs. But we see the proof of this waiver as being somewhat complex and probably not something to depend on. And so the recommendation we have here is to really kind of push quickly to start projects and get them moving to secure the safe harbor. Next slide, please. And so finally, loans. So far we've talked about raising equity and focusing in on the possibilities of raising equity from tax credits, and especially the investment tax credit, and from grants from New Era. The second big part of forming a funding request for the New Era program is determining how much loan to take and at what cost. And I talked through the possibilities of and the flexibilities of taking loans at different costs. So you can take 0% interest loans, a fixed 2%, or loans at the government cost of money at treasuries. And so as we showed in the sort of the previous section of the webinar, these concessional loans, the 0% and 2% loans take up more credit subsidy per dollar of lending. And so they can be appealing because of the low interest rates, but they don't stretch quite as far in terms of the financing they enable and the amount of project that you can build using that loan. And so there's a trade-off there. Second, we see it really as an important point that applicants should look at their package in terms of the ways that it builds financial strength. And so there can be a number of objectives that New Era applicants are trying to meet as they form their funding package. One is realizing a physical resource portfolio, and one that is competitive for the program, has a meaningful and competitive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Second is really providing benefits to members, and both in terms of the reliability and resilience of the electric system, but also in building sort of a strong balance sheet, being in a position to make investments later in the decade that are kind of outside of the scope of New Era, which is kind of an exciting possibility of this program. And so, in summary, the big pieces that we see as important as entities start to form their financing request are: one, thinking about the physical investments, the investments in new generation technologies and associated eligible investments for New Era that they want to make, and the cost of those investments, and figuring out how to meet them with a combination of grants and loans and tax credits that both deliver the physical resource portfolio, as well as strengthen the financial position of the utility in ways that can help create member benefits later on in the decade. I'll pause here. We're going to be turning to Uday next to talk through some more detail about the different levers that utilities can look at and push as they are developing a financing package, and show some of the modeling results that we've come up with as we change some of the cost of loans that a cooperative might elect, the amount of loan versus grant, and the use of the ITC versus BTC. So Uday, I'll turn back to you as we get into a little bit more detail and move from this qualitative logic to some of our more quantitative results.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. Let me first start by pausing a little bit. I know that we've been diving fairly deep into a lot of financial options and layering, and we've been talking a bit more in the abstract about some of these trade-offs. But as we are approaching the next section, where we hope to make it a little bit more concrete with an example, I just wanted to pause and ask if there were any specific questions that you might want to put into the Q&A about some of the issues that we've raised at a higher level. And so I'm going to just not talk for a few seconds here, let everyone catch their breath, and maybe give you a little time to type for the next minute or so before I dive into the example. And hopefully you've had a chance to get a little bit of time in to write up a question or two. We've seen a couple come in. Appreciate folks taking the time to do that. If we can, I'm going to jump in to start talking a little bit about the example that we have in mind. And then we'll take some time after that example to return to the questions that we got. So what I'm going to be getting to next is to go through a representative, but kind of in some ways a very substantial and big investment opportunity, and to talk a little bit about how some of these different options play out in practice. So if we can go out to the next slide, I'll walk you through the setup that we have in mind for this. We're imagining a situation where a cooperative is looking to add a very significant portfolio of potential clean energy resources to allow them to start to use a given fossil asset less over the next couple of years, maybe more rapidly than they otherwise would. It's a pretty big portfolio, but it can all be scaled up and down depending on what you might be trying to do. But we wanted to show that to kind of look at what happens when you reach the boundaries of this program's financing resources. So let's suppose that we've got a gigawatt of solar, 1.2 gigawatts of solar, 700 megawatts of wind, and a gigawatt of storage that you're trying to put up quickly. And you're really trying to factor down, reduce the emissions associated with operating an existing fossil facility with about 400 million in unrecovered plant costs that's been operating at reasonably high capacity factor. Now, what are the constraints that you face? You really don't want to use extra member equity to do this. You have broadband investments you make. You've got other things that you need to be doing with that equity on, or that you might be in a position where if you did have to raise that equity, you'd have to do it over years or do it quickly in order to avoid downgrades to your credit rating, which would create rate increases from making this transition. You really don't want your equity to capitalization ratio to get below 25%, to give you a little room on a forward-looking basis. And we assume that if you're taking an investment tax credit, well, since the investment tax credit, even with direct pay, doesn't come in until a little later after you start operations, we assume that there needs to be some bridge financing at roughly your weighted average cost of capital to hold you over until that new equity can come in through a direct pay grant, dollars coming in to repay you for your investment. So what's the approach that we use? We try to do some financial modeling to look at the different ways that you could use the New Era program to address some of these constraints and make it possible to make that investment in ways that do not, that address some of the constraints I just laid out. We looked at different loan options with different costs. One that's 0%, 2%, and then at Treasuries. For the Treasuries case, we make the assumption that I mentioned earlier, there's an issue with the credit subsidy cost that makes the Treasuries and the 2% seem to look the same. We are avoiding that by assuming, for example, that you could take a loan from the RUS separately or through other means to get at that Treasuries option, for example, through the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, which offers loans at Treasuries plus 37.5 basis points for many of these same activities, or that there is a change in the way that USDA might be doing this, or through the RUS itself, you can get Treasury rate loans. We assume that any amount that you don't use for a loan, you can take, you can use to get grants up to your maximum amount of allowable $970 million in appropriation that you've got. We assume that, and again, this holds for most of, given the current costs of clean energy assets have fallen significantly. What we are finding is that the benefit from taking the production tax credit on a net present value basis very frequently outpaces the benefit of switching to ITC for a lot of the cases. And so we're looking at a situation where the PTC for wind and solar are more attractive than the ITC over for your members, but unfortunately, of course, taking the production tax credit doesn't give you that equity up front. It's still, you still are on the hook to raise that equity quickly to avoid a near-term challenge to your equity to debt ratio. The ITC can provide that. So we look at the PTC first, but then switch to the ITC if we find that there isn't sufficient capital or sufficient equity to meet these constraints. And that's how we do our modeling. So let's turn to some of the results from this modeling as we look at this setup. And what we're going to be showing you, and if we go to the next slide, is we're going to be showing you some different financial metrics for the use of different types of loans. So the first thing we tried to do is just ask the question, hey, well, if you've got $970 million and you want to really make this work, why not just try to get as big of a 0% loan as you can get? And indeed, you could use a good chunk of your appropriation to get a very significant loan at 0%. So let's suppose that you're using as much of your $970 million appropriation as you can, and you get out a loan for about $2.1 billion. And let me just back up to say that the total financing that's needed for this particular asset is around $3.7 billion, including the cost of refinancing your $400 million unrecovered plan balance. So what you're really trying to go for, your North Star for this exercise, just so you know as you're looking at these numbers, is you want to finance $3.7 billion. So what can you do with the New Era program with a 0% loan and taking the production tax credit? Well, you should be able to get about $2.1 billion in financing at 0% interest rate, along with roughly, if you're taking the PTC, you'll get also, in addition, you'll have some amount of grant that you can add to that. And you will have about $600 million coming from direct pay financing associated with the investment tax credit for battery storage. Now, this creates a package that's about $2.7 billion in financing coming from New Era. If you use this package, you could get up to $1.6 billion in potential savings relative to business as usual. financing that is relative to a cooperative's cost of capital. But unfortunately, this isn't enough. I just showed you this gives you about $2.7 billion. You still have another $1 billion that you need to finance elsewhere. And what we find is that you would need additional debt and co-op equity, additional co-op debt and equity to make up the balance. There just isn't enough financing coming from the ITC or from the ITC from storage and from the New Era program to really make this work and still keep your capitalization ratios working. And there just flat out isn't enough appropriation to cover this full need. And in order to do this, you need to raise additional debt and equity to make sure that you're able to keep your 25% capitalization ratio. And that additional financing ultimately is what makes this scenario quite challenging to move forward with in practice. There is a large benefit, but you are left with this needing to raise significant equity and debt to back up this financing. And that isn't sufficient to make this work without having to find other sources of capital, and particularly immediately raise additional equity, which can be a significant challenge. So on the next slide, we ask the question, if you can't do this with a PTC, which you can't really do, because you'd need to find that equity, and there isn't an obvious source of equity without raising rates, what could you do if you instead made the shift to choose the ITC? Here, you could make a 0% loan work, but you'll give up some value. And indeed, the savings that you get from this package, from the financing coming from New Era and the direct pay, significantly go down. You can now meet your full $3.7 billion in financing with a $2 billion loan, some grants from New Era, and you indeed can meet it. You can get significant investment tax credits now coming in from through direct pay of not only the investment tax credit for your storage, but also for your solar and wind. This in total gives you the $3.7 billion in capital that you need. So about $2 billion in 0% loans, the investment tax credit with direct pay for the whole suite of wind, solar, and storage, that gets you up to that $3.7 billion. You have a small grant that also comes from that. You have an enormous amount of equity. This is a very large equity ratio for this particular project that's being enabled. But your savings are significantly less because you lost some value in having to choose the investment tax credit rather than taking the production tax credit. So on a net present value basis, the savings that you get from this financing package drop from what looked like about $1.6 billion in value from the tax credits and the New Era financing down to about $1.1 billion in value. So you gave up some significant potential savings from choosing the production tax credit in using the 0% loan. You still get a lot of value. There's no reason not to do something like this. And the additional benefit I will just flag here is that you actually raised a lot more equity than you needed in order to meet your constraints on debt to equity ratio. You have $1.1 billion in what is effectively excess equity relative to that 25% equity ratio threshold we were trying to go for. So you have extra equity that can allow you in future, as you think about other investment needs, gives you a cushion of equity that you might be able to use to address other capital needs. But you gave up something to get this. And so while you did generate a lot of equity from this program, you gave up some value for your members in the financing structure. So let's look at a couple of other options to see if there's something that can, a different option that can achieve a lot of these benefits of having that additional equity cushion, but really kind of getting you back the full BAU value of the financing in terms of benefit to your customers. So let's look at another case. Next slide, please. We looked at another case where we said, okay, well, the 0% with the ITC works pretty well, but it doesn't maximize the benefit of these programs. Is there something we can do? Well, let's ask what you can do with a 2% loan instead. Well, if you try to go for a 2% loan, you can lever up your the appropriation to get about $2.8 billion in lending while still mitigating your equity needs. You need about $320 million in grants from New Era. That combined with some of the with the direct pay investment tax credit from the storage, where you don't have a production tax credit opportunity, gives you just the right debt to equity ratio, so that with a 2% loan and the equity coming from a combination of the New Era program grant, that's the leftover that you didn't need in credit subsidy costs, and the amount coming from direct pay of the investment tax credit for the batteries, you can elect to take the production tax credit for both the solar and the wind. And that allows you to get what is essentially the full amount, in fact, a little bit more in savings in net present value from this package of New Era financing, increasing savings relative to taking the 0% loan by around $600 million. So there's significant additional value that you get because you can take the PTC and you can use a 2% loan versus a 0% loan is what we're seeing. But there's a downside to this. And the downside is that when you look at the actual equity cushion that you've got, well, you've got some cushion because you chose to take to try to, again, my constraint was I wanted to assume a 25% equity ratio. You really only strictly probably need a 20% equity ratio. So you've got some extra equity relative to what you might need, but you don't have this cushion of equity that you had in the 0% ITC case. So this is a situation where if you're already in a pretty good equity position, you just don't want to make this your equity position much worse. A 2% loan with a PTC doesn't give you much additional equity, but it doesn't use any of your existing equity, gives you a little bit more cushion, and gives you very significant savings, and can work for financing an asset. So let's move on to the final case where we ask the question, well, what could you do? Is there any other option that you can take that kind of has best of both worlds? Kind of get you everything that you want. You want to be able to take the PTC, you want to get the maximum value, and you want to have an equity cushion that's bigger than the cushion that you started with. And it turns out that if you can take debt at treasuries while mostly taking the money from New Era as a grant, this could be that Goldilocks option. If you're able to take a loan at close to treasuries, you're able to get most of the New Era program and grants. You still have direct pay. If you build some storage, you have direct pay ITC. The combination of those can get you total savings that are just like the 2% loan case, but give you an additional nearly $700 million in equity, more than you needed for this project as an additional cushion. So you get most of the benefit of the equity in the 0% case with ITC, but get it virtually all the same savings as you could have gotten from the 2% case with PTC, and no equity cushion if you have this option available to you. This is one of the reasons why, if you have the option to take a treasuries loan combined with the production tax credit for example, for solar and wind, it can be so attractive for a cooperative in that it allows you to really build the cushion, build that equity cushion on your balance sheet, while at the same time financing the full your full asset needs and creating maximum savings from the use of these financing vehicles. I'll note that the possible savings here is levered up relative to the total size of the grant. You have a $970 million in appropriation is getting you net present value of savings that exceed that significantly. And this is one of the reasons why this game is so important to play. There's a real value that can be brought, that can be had by using the right combination of grants and loans to meet the needs of the specific assets with the PTC and ITC that you need. And those savings, by the way, do include the relative benefit of being able to take the PTC rather than the ITC in some of these cases and get direct pay. So I just wanted to give this as a concrete example of how this game can be played with the right type of lending and financing vehicles to allow for a cooperative to really maximize the benefit that they're getting from here. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And we can move on to the final Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this simple example. I should note that we have built a model to look at these trade-offs. And one of the things that we are committing to doing is to refine that model and make it more broadly available. We're happy, at least at first, to engage with folks on a one-on-one basis with this model, but we're happy to engage also to try to make it available more publicly to folks who might just want to use it independently as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christian and Sam for a Q&A session.
Great, thanks all. So yeah, please keep the Q&A coming. I'm seeing some questions coming in, and so please keep those coming throughout this Q&A. Just stepping back for a second for Sam. Again, so if you were in charge of completing a New Era letter of intent, what questions are you asking yourself, and what analysis are you trying to put together to make sure you're putting together the best strategy for equity and debt?
Yeah. So I suppose I would think about a couple of different objectives. The first, of course, is being able to fund and finance a portfolio of assets that are part of the New Era application and part of a competitive New Era application. They're sort of maximizing the amount of greenhouse gas reductions that you can make in that resource portfolio to secure an award from New Era. But what that really comes back to is member benefits and thinking about, I think, the metric that I was speaking to in the previous charts, the savings relative to a business as usual scenario. So thinking about what are the savings that a cooperative can realize from a particular package of grants and loans at different costs and use of either the PTC or the ITC to both fund that resource while providing financial benefits that can flow down to members and create real savings, as well as kind of the ability for the cooperative to make investments in the future. And so that's really the sort of primary suggestion I'd make is thinking about the sort of financial benefits that can come from a New Era application, and thinking about the savings, especially that can flow from taking a particular combination of grants that can provide equity and probably, at least based on what we're seeing so far in our modeling, loans probably at treasuries as well as PTCs when possible. I will note that cooperatives, of course, will have particular balance sheet constraints, and so far we focused mostly on own assets and the possibility of owning assets, which we see as really valuable and attractive, especially with the possibility of taking direct pay tax credits. There will be reasons and particular circumstances and risks that co-ops are thinking about that will lead some entities to also look at purchase power, which is enabled by the program. And that's something we'll dive into a little bit more in detail in our session tomorrow. But when making those considerations as well and acknowledging sort of the different circumstances of cooperatives that are looking to fund plans with New Era financing, it does really just come back to the benefits that they can realize by forming a particular package of grants and loans and maximizing those savings, the net present value of savings relative to a business as usual scenario.
Thanks, Sam. Onto some specific questions in the model for Uday. So I just wanted to go back and maybe kind of reframe and summarize the steps that you think a co-op should be taking when kind of conducting their analysis. So first, we're trying to determine kind of what size of the loan makes sense and also kind of what interest rates we're trying to use. Then trying to calculate, given that, how much grant funding could you still receive with your remaining New Era appropriation, and then determining if you're taking the PTC or the ITC for extra equity. Is that correct? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's right. I think one way to think about this is that there are many levers that you've got available to you. Because of the way the program was written, there is flexibility in what you can ask for in financing in a way that usually hasn't been the case necessarily in asking for our US financing. The program offers that flexibility to ask for some combination of grants and loans with different characteristics. Now, the difficulty is, anytime you get choices, it can lead to challenges in sort of navigating all of those different choices. And so the way that we're suggesting approaching this is to really ask the question, okay, well, let's start with a project that I've got in mind or a set of activities that I have in mind. And how can I structure a lending package with different approaches to using tax credits that maximizes the benefit? And I can start, one way to sort of crack that is to start by saying, okay, how much of a loan can I get at 0%, 2%, et cetera? How much does that leave me? Well, how much of a loan, what does that imply if I take the ITC and PTC in terms of the equity that I need? And how can I find a way, what's the net present value of all of that given different approaches, different combinations that I can take. And the hope is that you can find a sweet spot where you've got the right amount of lending at the right percentage to maximize your net present value while leaving you with the biggest equity cushion at the end of the day. And that's what we see seems to be possible. So in our example, we saw that even if you have a very large financing need, it's a pretty big $3.7 billion financing need to really reduce emissions by deploying a whole bunch of fairly commercial clean energy technologies in the not too distant future. You can still meet that need while increasing your equity cushion if you use these programs right. And that's the thing that we think is possible and that we're excited.
And here's a two-parter, Uday, on kind of the grant and loans question. So first, could you take all of the New Era supporting grants, and why not would you want to do that? And then secondly, kind of going off of that, what are some of the trade-offs between kind of taking those grants versus taking the loans?
Sure. So one of the benefits of the New Era program is that it, indeed, you can take a very significant or all of it in grants. That creates an equity cushion that can be very, very valuable. However, that leaves you still with the need to find other financing. Now, a lot of cooperatives have access to public capital markets. Now, at the end of the day, those capital markets are still going to be somewhere between 150 to 200 basis points more expensive than using debt at, for example, treasuries from the New Era program. And what we're finding in our results is that there is some value in getting New Era debt at either 2% or treasuries that really allows you to achieve greater net present value benefit than just simply sort of using the money, using the program to get grants to buttress your equity pool, because that New Era funding does provide you access to capital, which is sufficiently below the cost of capital that you can otherwise access. That especially if you have a large financing need, it makes a lot of sense to split that to some degree between financing and grants. But you probably want to get the financing as high of an interest rate close to treasuries as you can, is what we're seeing. That's where you maximize your benefit.
Great. And then one more specific question we have on the modeling. What discount rate are you using for the NPV analysis?
For this simple analysis that we did, we assumed roughly a 5% nominal discount rate. The analysis can easily be done. Our model is very easily flexible in terms of the sort of assumed forward-looking cost of debt, as well as the discount rate used. We hope to, again, make this more publicly available so that you all can use something like this if you want to take a look at the specific situation that you're interested in. We're happy to talk further about this. The rationale for that ultimately was that we assumed that a cooperative that would roughly correspond to on the high end, the forward-looking weighted average cost of capital for cooperatives in the coming couple of years, including a reasonable return on equity, as well as likely cost of debt, including a spread relative to what are elevated treasuries right now.
Great. And then Sam, or either one of you actually, could you talk a little bit about the timing of the ITC and especially how bridge financing plays a role in that?
Yeah, I'll start here and then turn to Uday. So as we've talked through, the investment tax credit can be a really important way to raise equity for a project. But that comes in after year one of the project's operations. And so there's a bit of a gap in which the cooperative would need to basically fill with financing, sort of bridge financing, until they receive the tax credit payment. And in the model, we look at bridge financing sort of at the utilities weighted average cost of capital. And this is a place where we think utilities will be able to kind of look at existing borrowing relationships. I'll note here an important distinction between cooperatives that are taking a project award versus a system award from the New Era program. With the project award, the funding will come in later on, but a system award allows much more flexibility in a number of ways, including the timing of when the cooperative is able to take in the funding benefits from the USDA. And the USDA and the RUS in webinars and in some of their written responses have, and in the notice of funding opportunity, have indicated that they might be able to provide financing early on that could be potentially used to fill that gap. But likely there, or in many situations, there may still be a need for a cooperative to go out and seek bridge financing until they receive the tax credit if they're electing to take an investment tax credit for a project.
That's right, and I think that it's a really important point. That one other point I will make is that indeed, in the system level opportunity, there is more flexibility than I think there has been in the past, and there is clarity from USDA that providing financing prior to completion of a project or at acquisition is something that is allowable with new era financing in a way that hasn't necessarily been the case. That the timing issues that USD can and will be flexible when it comes to these timing issues.
Great, and then shifting a little bit actually, so we focused a lot on G&Ts in this presentation, but for distribution co-ops, are there any scenarios under which a distribution co-op may want to pursue its own generation and sell that back wholesale to the G&T? An example for like community solar that serves its membership?
Maybe I'll take we'll talk a little bit more about different types of partnership opportunities that might be really attractive and be valuable on a forward-looking basis. And I will flag that particularly for areas, for example, where distribution co-ops are uniquely well placed to really help deploy capital in resources that can have significant value more broadly, not just to their system, but to the entire system that a G&T serves. This can be a really interesting and attractive opportunity. For example, community solar with storage, for example, could be a valuable resource from a capacity perspective across the system. And there should be opportunities for developers, or rather for distribution co-ops to work with developers to build out these resources, which, for example, just may not make a lot of sense for G&T to own just because their scale and size is likely going to be limited in order to maximize the tax credit value. But if deployed, could really add value to the whole system in creating both flexibility and reducing costs for provision of power in certain, particularly in remote areas. And so there's a real opportunity for partnerships here between G&Ts and distribution co-ops to identify particularly attractive resources that a distribution co-op would be better placed to deploy as a result in part of the tax incentive structure, but also because of the value that they may bring on the distribution side in avoiding investments that might be needed on the G&T side to provide similar service in ways that ideally, again, can be addressed in ways that reduce costs for the whole system in an equitable way across all of the members, which is, of course, got to be crucial for making something like this work.
Great. And then so we've kind of seen through this modeling that there are a lot of complex decisions and not necessarily one right answer, depending on your goals and targets. What are some of the key variables you think co-ops should consider when trying to maximize and make use of this new era financing?
So go ahead, Sam, actually.
But yeah, I can start and let Dave fill in as well. I think we've talked through a number of the variables that cooperatives can think through, and of course, one of them is equity targets, and making sure that there is enough equity both to fund the project, taken in from either the New Era grants or from investment tax credits, as well as to hopefully build more equity on the cooperative's balance sheet. The second is net present value benefits for members. And this is, I think, an important point when thinking about the many different uses of the financing. And again, we'll get into more detail about some of these uses in our session tomorrow. But the uses of the funding from New Era can include deployment in new technologies and generation technologies. It can include investments in activities that support those generation technologies, and so that includes things like transmission upgrades and storage. It can also include modifying RUS debt on a stranded asset or refinancing third-party debt on a stranded asset. And when thinking about the many different uses for the financing, it's important to kind of consider how a package of different financial tools, grants and loans and tax credits leads to member benefits when funding all that entire package as a whole. There might seem to be specific uses, for example, a very low cost loan to help with refinancing a stranded asset that looks appealing, but that should really be compared against a package that uses higher cost debt and might be able to create greater savings with a similar outcome. And so the variables, again, thinking about how to ensure sufficient equity, and then how to have the right amount or right cost and right amount of debt to really fund the sort of objective of the project. Those are kind of some of the key goals and targets that I would keep closely in mind.
Maybe I'll just add on to that. I do think it's important, in addition, of course, to as we're thinking about the story around how to use these financing resources to optimize the benefits and maximize the value. Of course, with all of these resources comes risk. And one thing I did want to acknowledge, and we'll talk more about particularly tomorrow, is to talk a little bit about kind of ultimately a risk-adjusted return, if you'd like. I mean, essentially, we want to make sure that at the end of the day, that the financing package that you take on and the value that you're getting is really value maximizing while adjusting for the potential risk that you're taking on. And for a lot of cooperatives, we understand that in particular, even relatively commercial renewable technologies, while you have purchased and used them, you haven't necessarily had, because of the way that the tax credits have been structured, owned these assets. And that creates some additional risk in ownership over time. And so there are alternative structures we'll talk about a little bit that also can help with mitigating this risk in the way that you might want to structure thinking about the financing and the packages that you use. But it is also important to note that many of the additional risks associated with operating and owning renewable assets can be mitigated through other means that aren't necessarily just financial. For example, just having a lot of equity in some of these transactions, so it mitigates some of that risk. So does potentially having contractual structures in place that include full O&M wraps and other things like that. So there are other mechanisms that can be put in place to mitigate some of those risks. And we'll talk about one or two of them tomorrow as a preview for some of the conversations we want to have. Depending on the structure of the particular assets that you're deploying, there may be multiple conversations or multiple options that might better meet the specific risk appetite that you have while creating maximum value. And we're, again, excited to discuss these options on a forward-looking basis, and excited to connect tomorrow to discuss all of these issues in more detail.
And for the final question, I'd like a short answer from both of you. One, what are you most excited about from this program? And then also, what are your biggest concerns that co-ops should look out for when taking advantage of this program? Sam, I'll start with you.
I think the program is one of the reasons why we're so excited about it is that it really does, we think, a good job, or could do a good job of resolving some really meaningful financial barriers that cooperatives have faced in the past to making use of inexpensive wind and solar and storage and these technologies that have created benefits for lots of people around the country, but haven't been able to flow directly to the members of cooperatives, at least not at the scale that they could. And so this program really kind of unlocks that possibility in a meaningful way, and is quite exciting for that reason. Things are moving very quickly. It's a complex problem, and the decisions cooperatives need to make about what the package of investments they want to submit for the New Era program is, and then structuring a funding request are non-trivial. They're complex. They require a lot of decision making, and those decisions need to happen fairly quickly. The letters of intent are due at the end of August, and then applications will happen quickly this fall for the entities that are invited to proceed and submit applications. And so it's going to be a busy summer. Cooperatives will need to pay attention to more guidance coming out from the RUS and from Treasury to understand the sort of final details of what's enabled by the program and the final rules. And then really form a package and put themselves in a position to kind of act on and deliver the most value to their members through making investments fairly quickly and making investment decisions fairly quickly. And that is a meaningful challenge, and one that RMI and lots of other organizations are sort of excited to help support thinking on, but one that comes with risks and difficulties.
Maybe I'll start. What am I most excited about? This is a program that can set co-ops up to be financially sustainable and continue providing affordable power for their communities for the next 100 years. If we can manage that, that's success, and that's really exciting. To keep this model and to keep cooperatives being able to do what they've been doing for the last 100 for the next 100 years. In terms of what I'm worried about, it's the same thing Sam said. There isn't much time. We have to figure out how to plan for a sustainable, for sort of making this shift much more rapidly. And just in a few months, there are plans that could unlock this value that create financial sustainability for co-ops for the next 100 years, but we don't have very much time to figure out how to make this work. And this is why we're eager to find ways to be supportive of this process.
Great, thank you both. I will kick it to Ali, and please do not leave yet because we have some important closing information.
Great, thank you. Few closing notes. As you may have saw, Christine just put this in the chat. We are hosting a second session tomorrow on defining an ambitious and affordable new era plan. Link to register is in the chat as well, same time. As I talked about briefly at the beginning, we'll be moving from today, where we focused on the rules of the game, the various pieces you have at your disposal and how you may use them, to actually seeing what that looks like in process and how those various strategies could play out over time. So if you're interested in a little more detail, definitely join us tomorrow. All slides, recordings, and some additional resources that we are pulling together will be emailed to attendees following the trainings and posted publicly soon after. And as Uday mentioned a little bit earlier, we are also funded to provide one-on-one support to New Era applicants. So please reach out to us if you would like to discuss financial strategies in more detail or utilize the model and expertise that Uday and Sam walked through today. And with that, that is the end of our webinar for today. Here are a few emails you can reach out to if you have more specific questions that you'd like to share. We can talk about them tomorrow. And if you're interested in hearing more about the modeling and one-on-one opportunities. Thank you all. Talk to you tomorrow.